Okay, there we go. It's giving me trouble. Ah, yeah. All right. Cat just tried bringing in a garter snake. Oh, Cat. That's funny. All right. Oh, KC, I did not get a chance to say thank you for signing up to be a super fan. I really appreciate that. All right, so I'm going to get started here. Hey, Gam Gam, how are you? Hey, Spooky Art Kitten! How are you? I haven't seen you in forever. How are you doing, my friend? DK, how you doing, brother? Alrighty then. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Storytime with UndeadPapa. This is the final night of my birthday week live streams. I am doing okay. I think the last time I saw you, I was still at like 2,300 followers, and now I'm almost at 14,000 just from going live and telling stories. Well, thank you. Thank you. So, tonight, we descend into obsession, curiosity, transformation, and paranoia. Thank you. So wherever you're listening from, dim the lights, sit back and relax, because story time is about to begin. Our first story tonight was written in June of 1917 and first published in March of 1922. I'm getting there, don't rush me. A tale of isolation, obsession, and the pull of the past. This is The Tomb by H.P. Lovecraft. In relating the circumstances which have led to my confinement within this refuge for the demented, I am aware that my present position will create a natural doubt of the authenticity of my narrative. It is an unfortunate fact that the bulk of humanity is too limited in its mental vision to weigh with patience and intelligence those isolated phenomena, seen and felt only by a psychologically sensitive few, which lie outside its common experience. Men of broader intellect know that there is no sharp distinction betwixt the real and the unreal, that all things appear as they do only by virtue of the delicate individual physical and mental media through which we are made conscious of them. But the prosaic materialism of the majority condemns as madness the flashes of supersight which penetrate the common veil of obvious empiricism. My name is Jervis Dudley, and from earliest childhood I have been a dreamer and a visionary. Wealthy beyond the necessity of a commercial life, and temperamentally unfitted for the formal studies and social recreations of my acquaintances, I have dwelt ever in realms apart from the visible world, spending my youth and adolescence in ancient little-known books, and in roaming the fields and groves of the region near my ancestral home. I do not think that what I read in those books or saw in these fields and groves was exactly what other boys read and saw there, but of this I must say little, since detailed speech would but confirm those cruel slanders upon my intellect which I sometimes overhear from the whispers of the stealthy attendants around me. It is sufficient for me to relate events without analyzing causes. I have said that I dwelt apart from the visible world, but I have not said that I dwelt alone. This no human creature may do, for lacking the fellowship of the living, he inevitably draws upon the companionship of things that are not, or are no longer, living. Close by my home there lies a singular wooded hollow, in whose twilight deeps I spent most of my time, reading, thinking, and dreaming. Down its moss-covered slopes my first steps of infancy were taken, and around its grotesquely gnarled oak trees my first fancies of boyhood were woven. Well did I come to know the presiding dryads of those trees, and often have I watched their wild dances in the struggling beams of waning moon. But of these things I must not now speak. I will tell only of the lone tomb in the darkest of the hillside thickets, the deserted tomb of the Hydes, an old and exalted family whose last direct descendant had been laid within its black recesses many decades before my birth. The vault to which I refer is an ancient granite, weathered and discolored by the mists and dampness of generations. Excavated back into the hillside, the structure is visibly only at the entrance. The door, a ponderous and forbidding slab of stone, hangs upon rusted iron hinges and is fastened ajar in the queerly sinister way by means of heavy iron chains and padlocks, according to a gruesome fashion of half a century ago. The abode of the race whose scions are inurned once crowned the declivity which holds the tomb, but had long since fallen victim to the flames which sprang up from a disastrous stroke of lightning. Of the midnight storm which destroyed this gloomy mansion, the older inhabitants of the region sometimes speak in hushed and uneasy voices, alluding to what they call divine wrath, in a manner that in later years vaguely increased the always strong fascination which I felt for the forest-darkened sepulchre. One man only had perished in the fire, when the last of the Hydes was buried in this place of shade and stillness. The sad urnful of ashes had come from a distant land, to which the family had repaired when the mansion burned down. No one remains to lay flowers before the granite. Let me start that over. No one remains to lay flowers before the granite portal. A few care to brave the depressing shadows which seem to linger strangely about the water-worn stones. I shall never forget the afternoon when I first stumbled upon the half-hidden house of the dead. It was in midsummer, when the alchemy of nature transmutes the sylvan landscape to one vivid and almost homogeneous mass of green, when the senses are well nigh intoxicated with the surging seas of moist verdure and the subtly indefinable odors of the soil and the vegetation. In such surroundings the mind loses its perspective, time and space become trivial and unreal, and echoes of a forgotten prehistoric past beat insistently upon the enthralled consciousness. All day I had been wandering through the mystic groves of the hollow, thinking thoughts I need not discuss, and conversing with things I need not name. In years a child of 10, I had seen and heard many wonders unknown to the throng, and was oddly aged in certain respects. When, upon forcing my way between two savage clumps of briars, I suddenly encountered the entrance of the vault, I had no knowledge of what I had discovered. The dark blocks of granite, the door so curiously ajar, and the funereal carvings above the arch aroused in me no associations of mournful or terrible character. Of graves and tombs I knew and imagined much, but had, on account of my peculiar temperament, been kept from all personal contact with churchyards and cemeteries. The strange stone house on which churchyards and the strange stone house on the woodland slope was to me only a source of interest and speculation, and its cold, damp interior, into which I vainly peered through the aperture so tantalizingly left, contained for me no hint of death or decay. But in that instant of curiosity was born the madly unreasoning desire which has brought me to this hell of confinement. Spurred on by a voice which must have come from the hideous soul of the forest, I resolved to enter the beckoning gloom in spite of the ponderous chains which barred my passage. In the waning light of day, I alternately rattled the rusted impediments with a view to throwing wide the stone door, and essayed to squeeze my slight form through the space already provided. But neither plan met with success. At first curious, I was not frantic, and when in the thickening twilight I returned to my home, I had sworn to the 100 gods of the grove that at any cost I would some day force an entrance to the black chilly depths that seemed calling out to me. The physician with the iron-gray beard who comes each day to my room once told a visitor that his decision marked the beginnings of a pitiful monomania, but I will leave final judgment to my readers when they shall have learnt all. Thank you, Hells. I really appreciate that. The months following my discovery were spent in futile attempts to force the complicated padlock of the slightly open vault, and in carefully guarded inquiries regarding the nature and history of the structure. With the traditionally receptive ears of the small boy, I learned much through an habitual secretiveness caused me to tell no one of my information or my resolve. It is perhaps worth mentioning that I was not at all surprised or terrified on learning of the nature of the vault. My rather original ideas regarding life and death had caused me to associate the cold clay with the breathing body in a vague fashion, and I felt the great sinister family of the burned-down mansion was in some way represented within the stone space I sought to explore. Mumbled tales of the weird rites and godless revels of the bygone years in the ancient hall gave to me a new and potent interest in the tomb, before whose door I would sit for hours at a time each day. Once I thrust a candle within the nearly closed entrance, but could see nothing save a flight of damp stone steps leading downward. The odor of the place repelled yet bewitched me. I felt I had known it before, in a past remote beyond all recollection, beyond even my tenancy of the body I now possess. The year after I first beheld the tomb, I stumbled upon a worm-eaten translation of Plutarch's Lives in the book-filled attic of my home. Reading the life of Theseus, I was much impressed that passage telling by that passage telling of the great stone beneath which the boyish hero was to find his tokens of destiny whenever he should become old enough to lift its enormous weight. This legend had the effect of dispelling my keenest impatience to enter the vault, for it made me feel the time was not yet ripe. Later, I told myself I should grow to a strength and ingenuity which might enable me to unfasten the heavily chained door with ease. But until then, I would do better by conforming to what seemed the will of fate. Accordingly, my watches by the dank portal became less persistent, and much of my time was spent in other though equally strange pursuits. I would sometimes rise very quietly in the night, stealing out to walk in those churchyards and places of burial from which I had been kept by my parents. What I did there I may not say, for I am not now sure of the reality of certain things. But I know that on the day after such a nocturnal ramble I would often astonish those about me with my knowledge of topics almost forgotten for many generations. It was after a night like this that I shocked the community with a queer conceit about the burial of the rich and celebrated Squire Brewster, a maker of local history who was interred in 1711, and whose slate headstone, bearing a graven skull and crossbones, was slowly crumbling to power. In a moment of childish imagination, I vowed not only that the undertaker, Goodman Simpson, had stolen the silver-buckled shoes, silken hose, and satin small clothes of the deceased before burial, but that the squire himself, not fully inanimate, had turned twice in his mound-covered coffin on the day of interment. But the idea of entering the tomb never left my thoughts, being indeed stimulated by the unexpected genealogical discovery that my own maternal ancestry possessed at least a slight link with the supposedly extinct family of the Hydes. Last of my paternal race, I was likewise the last of this older and more mysterious line. I began to feel that the tomb was mine, and to look forward with hot eagerness to the time when I might pass within that stone door and down those slimy stone steps into the dark. I now formed the habit of listening very intently at the slightly open portal, choosing my favorite hours of midnight stillness for the odd vigil. By the time I came of age, I had made a small clearing in the thicket before the mold-stained facade of the hillside, allowing the surrounding vegetation to encircle and overhang the space like the walls and roof of a sylvan bower. This bower was my temple, the fastened door my shrine, and here I would lie outstretched on the mossy ground, thinking strange thoughts and dreaming of strange dreams. The night of the first revelation was a sultry one. I must have fallen asleep from fatigue, for it was with a distinct sense of awakening that I heard the voices. Of those tones and accents I hesitate to speak, of their quality I will not speak, but I may say that they presented certain uncanny differences in vocabulary, pronunciation, and mode of utterance. Every shade of New England dialect, from the uncouth syllables of the Puritan colonists to the precise rhetoric of 50 years ago, seemed represented in that shadowy colloquy. Though it was only later that I noticed the fact. At the time, indeed, my attention was distracted from this matter by another phenomenon, a phenomenon so fleeting that I could not take oath upon its reality. I barely fancied that as I awoke, a light had been hurriedly extinguished within the sunken sepulchre. I do not think I was either astounded or panic-stricken, but I know that I was greatly and permanently changed that night. Upon returning home, I went with much directness to a rotting chest in the attic, wherein I found the key which next day unlocked with ease the barrier I had so long stormed in vain. It was in the soft glow of late afternoon that I first entered the vault on the abandoned slope. The spell was upon me, and my heart leaped in exultation I can but ill describe. As I closed the door behind me and descended the dripping steps by the light of my lone candle, I seemed to know the way, and though the candles sputtered with the stifling reek of the place. Holy cow. Sorry about that. I felt singularly at home in the musty, charnel house air. Looking about me, I beheld many marble slabs bearing coffins, or the remains of coffins. Some of these were sealed and intact, but others had nearly vanished, leaving the silver handles and plates isolated amidst certain curious heaps of whitish dust. Upon one plate I read the name of Sir Geoffrey Hyde, who had come from Sussex in 1640 and died here a few years later. In a conspicuous alcove was one fairly well-preserved and unattended casket, adorned with a single name which brought to me both a smile and a shudder. An odd impulse caused me to climb upon the broad slab, extinguish my candle, and lie down within the vacant box. In the gray light of dawn, I staggered from the vault and locked the chain of the door behind me. I was no longer a young man. Though but 21, winters had chilled my bodily frame. Early rising villagers who observed my homeward progress looked at me strangely and marveled at the signs of ribald revelry which they saw in one whose life was now to be sober and solitary. I did not appear before my parents till after a long and refreshing sleep. Henceforward I haunted the tomb each night, seeing, hearing, and doing things I must never reveal. My speech, always susceptible to environmental influences, was the first thing to succumb to the change, and my suddenly acquired archaism of diction was soon remarked upon. Later, a queer boldness and recklessness came into my demeanor, till I unconsciously grew to possess the bearing of a man of the world despite my lifelong seclusion. My formerly silent tongue waxed voluble with the easy grace of a Chesterfield or the godless cynicism of a Rochester. I displayed a peculiar erudition, utterly unlike the fantastic, monkish lore over which I had pored in youth, and covered the fly-leaves of my books with facile impromptu epigrams, which brought up suggestions of Gay, Prior, and the sprightliest of Augustan wits and rhymesters. Wow! Love H.P. Lovecraft, but man, there is some... there are some words that he just makes me stumble over. One morning at breakfast I came close to disaster by declaiming in palpably licorice accents an effusion of 18th century bacchanalian mirth, a bit of Georgian playfulness never recorded in a book, which ran something like this: "Come hither, my lads, with your tankards of ale, and drink to the present before it shall fail. Pile each on your platter a mountain of beef, for 'tis eating and drinking that bring us relief. So fill up your glass, so life will soon pass. When you are dead, you'll ne'er drink to your king or your lass. Anacreon had a red nose, so they say, but what's a red nose if you're happy and gay? Gad split me, I'd rather be red whilst I'm here, than white as a lily and dead half a year. So Betty, my miss, come give me a kiss. In hell there's no innkeeper's daughter like this. Young Harry, propped up just as straight as he's able, will soon lose his wig and slip under the table. But fill up your goblets and pass 'em around, better under the table than under the ground. So revel in chaff as ye thirstily quaff. Under 6 feet of dirt 'tis less easy to laugh. A friend strike me blue, I'm scarce able to walk, and damn me if I can stand upright or talk. Here, landlord, bid Betty to summon a chair. I'll try home for a while, for my wife is not there. So lend me a hand, I'm not able to stand, but I'm gay whilst I linger on top of the land. About this time I conceived my present fear of fire and thunderstorms. Previously indifferent to such things, I had now an unspeakable horror of them, and would retire to the innermost recesses of the house whenever the heavens threatened an electrical display. A favorite haunt of mine during the day was the ruined cellar of the mansion that had burned down, and in fancy I would picture the structure as it had been in its prime. On one occasion I startled a villager by leading him confidently to a shallow sub-cellar of whose existence I seemed to know in spite of the fact that it had been unseen and forgotten for many generations. At last came that which I had long feared. My parents, alarmed at the altered manner and appearance of their only son, commenced to exert over my movements a kindly espionage which threatened to result in disaster. I had told no one of my visits to the tomb, having guarded my secret purpose with religious zeal since childhood. But now I was forced to exercise care in threading the mazes of the wooded hollow, that I might throw off a possible pursuer. My key to the vault I kept suspended from a cord about my neck, its presence known only to me. I never carried out of the sepulchre any of the things I came upon whilst within its walls. One morning, as I emerged from the damp tomb and fastened the chain of the portal with none too steady hand, I beheld in an adjacent thicket the dreaded face of a watcher. Surely the end was near, for my bower was discovered, and the objective of my nocturnal journeys revealed. The man did not accost me, so I hastened home in an effort to overhear what he might report to my careworn father. Were my sojourns beyond the chained door about to be proclaimed to the world? Imagine my delighted astonishment on hearing the spy inform my parent in cautious whisper that I had spent the night in the bower outside the tomb, my sleep-filmed eyes fixed upon the crevice where the padlocked portal stood ajar. By what miracle had the watcher been thus deluded? I was now convinced that a supernatural agency protected me. Made bold by this heaven-sent circumstance, I began to resume perfect openness in going to the vault, confident that no one could witness my entrance. For a week I tasted to the full the joys of that charnel conviviality which I must not describe, when the thing happened, and I was borne away to this accursed abode of sorrow and monotony. I should not have ventured out that night, for the taint of thunder was in the clouds, and hellish phosphorescence rose from the rank swamp at the bottom of the hollow. The call of the dead, too, was different. Instead of the hillside tomb, it was the charred cellar on the crest of the slope, whose presiding demon beckoned to me with unseen fingers. As I emerged from an intervening grove upon the plain before the ruin, I beheld in the misty moonlight a thing I had always vaguely expected. The mansion, gone for a century, once more reared its stately height to the raptured vision, every window ablaze with the splendor of many candles. Up the long drive rolled the coaches of the Boston gentry, whilst on foot came a numerous assemblage of powdered exquisites from the neighboring mansions. With this throng I mingled, though I knew I belonged with the hosts rather than the guests. Inside the hall were music, laughter, and wine on every hand. Several faces I recognized, though I should have known them better had they been shriveled or eaten away by death and decomposition. Amidst a wild and reckless throng I was the wildest and most abandoned. Gay blasphemy poured in torrents from my lips, and in my shocking sallies I heeded no law of God, man, or nature. Suddenly a peal of thunder, resonant even above the din of the swinish revelry, clave the very roof, and laid a hush of fear upon the boisterous company. Red tongues of flame and searing gusts of heat engulfed the house, and the roysters, struck with terror at the descent of a calamity which seemed to transcend the bounds of unguided nature, fled shrieking into the night. I alone remained, riveted to my seat by a groveling fear which I had never felt before. And then a second horror took possession of my soul. Burnt alive to ashes, my body dispersed by the four winds, I might never lie in the tomb of hides. Was not my coffin prepared for me? Had I not a right to rest till eternity amongst the descendants of Sir Geoffrey Hyde? I would claim my heritage of death, even though my soul go seeking through the ages for another corporeal tenement to represent it on the vacant slab in the alcove of the vault. Jervis Hyde should never share the sad fate of Palinurus. As the phantom of the burning house faded, I found myself screaming and struggling madly in the arms of two men, one of whom was the spy who had followed me to the tomb. Rain was pouring down in torrents, and upon the southern horizon were flashes of lightning that had so lately passed over our heads. My father, his face lined with sorrow, stood by as I shouted my demands to be laid within the tomb, frequently admonishing my captors to treat me as gently as they could. A blackened circle on the floor of the ruined cellar told of a violent stroke from the heavens, and from this spot a group of curious villagers with lanterns were prying a small box of antique workmanship which the thunderbolt had brought to light. Ceasing my futile and now objectless writhing, I watched the spectators as they viewed the treasure trove, and was permitted to share in their discoveries. The box, whose fastenings were broken by the stroke which had unearthed it, contained many papers and objects of value, but I had eyes for one thing alone. It was the porcelain miniature of a young man in a smartly curled bag wig, and bore the initials J.H. The face was such that as I gazed I might well have been studying my mirror. On the following day I was brought to this room with the barred windows, but I have been kept informed of certain things through an aged and simple-minded servitor, for whom I bore a fondness in infancy, and who, like me, loves the churchyard. What I have dared relate of my experiences within the vault has brought me only pitying smiles. My father, who visits me frequently, declares that at no time did I pass the chained portal, and swears that the rusted padlock had not been touched for 50 years when he examined it. He even says that all the village knew of my journeys to the tomb, and that I was often watched as I slept in the bower outside the grim facade, my half-opened eyes fixed on the crevice that leads to the interior. Against these assertions I have no tangible proof to offer, since my key to the padlock was lost in the struggle on that night of horrors. The strange things of the past which I learnt during those nocturnal meetings with the dead he dismisses as the fruits of my lifelong and omnivorous browsing amongst the ancient volumes of the family library. Had it not been for my old servant Hiram, I should have by this time become quite convinced of my madness. But Hiram, loyal to the last, has held faith in me, and has done that which impels me to make public at least part of my story. A week ago he burst open the lock which chains the door of the tomb perpetually ajar, and descended with a lantern into the murky depths. On a slab in the alcove he found an old but empty coffin, whose tarnished plate bears the single word, Jervis. In that coffin, and in that vault, they have promised I shall be buried. Dun, dun, dun. What'd you guys think of that one? Yes. Fat movie guy, what's up, brother? Didn't see you come in, man. I am just hanging out, reading some stories, man. For those of you that don't follow him, my good buddy, the Fat Movie Guy, thank you, sir. He's loves movies and pop culture, and he's a big fan of Deadpool. I can tell you that. Go give him a follow. His videos are great, and damn good person too. Just he says the F word a lot, especially when he gets excited. He absolutely does horror. He loves horror movies, just like you and I do, Tessa. Awesome. He loves Deadpool. Great guy. Nice. Well, thank you guys for giving him a follow. You won't regret it, I promise. That's right. Deadpool. I gotta watch the Punisher special yet, so it good? Yeah. I gotta sit down and watch it. Punisher is my favorite. Always has been. Alrighty then. I mean, Tessa, you haven't steered me wrong yet, but I think you and I share a brain. So. But scar you in the best way. Tessa, I am so glad you're here. That just makes me happy. For those of you that don't know, Tessa Vale Audio is a voice actor of the highest caliber and just a good person. Get more therapy. Yes, we all need more therapy. All right. Well, I am going to continue. Oh, jeez. Same. Same. Well, our next story comes from one of the architects of the Twilight Zone. The story was first published in April of 1951, the story of a misfit who longs to be something more than he is. This is Blood Sun by Richard Matheson. The people on the block decided definitely that Jules was crazy when they heard about his composition. There had been suspicions for a long time. He made people shiver with his blank stare. His coarse, guttural tongue sounded unnatural in his frail body. The paleness of his skin upset many children. It seemed to hang loose from his flesh. He hated sunlight. And his ideas were a little out of place for the people who lived on the block. Jules wanted to be a vampire. People declared it common knowledge that he was born on a night when winds uprooted trees. They said he was born with 3 teeth. They said he used them to fasten himself on his mother's breast, drawing blood with the milk. They said he used to cackle and bark in his crib after dark. They said he walked at 2 months and sat staring at the moon whenever it shone. Those were things that people said. His parents were always worried about him. An only child, they noticed his flaws quickly. They thought he was blind until the doctor told them it was just a vacuous stare. He told them that Jules, with his large head, might be a genius or an idiot. It turned out he was an idiot. He never spoke a word until he was 5. Then one night, coming up to supper, he sat down at the table and said, "Death." His parents were torn between delight and disgust. They finally settled for a place in between the two feelings. They decided that Jules couldn't have realized what the word meant. But Jules did. From that night on, he built up such a large vocabulary that everyone who knew him was astonished. He not only acquired every word spoken to him, words from signs, magazines, books, he made up his own words, like night touch or kill love. They were really several words that melted into each other. They said things Jules felt but couldn't explain with other words. He used to sit on the porch while the other children played hopscotch, stickball, and other games. He sat there and stared at the sidewalk and made up words. Until he was 12, Jules kept pretty much out of trouble. Of course, there was the time they found him undressing Olive Jones in an alley, and another time he was discovered dissecting a kitten on his bed. But there were many years in between. Those scandals were forgotten. In general, he went through childhood merely disgusting people. He went to school but never studied. He spent about 2 or 3 terms in each grade. The teachers all knew him by his first name. In some subjects, like reading and writing, he was almost brilliant. In others, he was hopeless. One Saturday when he was 12, Jules went to the movies. He saw Dracula. When the show was over, he walked a throbbing nerve mass through the little girl and boy ranks. He went home and locked himself in the bathroom for 2 hours. His parents pounded on the door and threatened, but he wouldn't come out. Finally, he unlocked the door and sat down at the supper table. He had a bandage on his thumb and a satisfied look on his face. The morning after he went to the library. It was Sunday. He sat on the steps all day, waiting for it to open. Finally, he went home. The next morning, he came back instead of going to school. He found Dracula on the shelves. He couldn't borrow it because he wasn't a member, and to be a member, he had to bring one of his parents. So he stuck the book down his pants and left the library and never brought it back. He went to the park and sat down and read the book through. It was late evening before he finished. He started at the beginning again, reading as he ran from streetlight to streetlight all the way home. He didn't hear a word of the scolding he got for missing lunch and supper. He ate, went in his room, and read the book to the finish. They asked him where he got the book. He said he found it. As the days passed, Jules read the story over and over. He never went to school. Late at night, when he had fallen into an exhausted slumber, his mother used to take the book into the living room and show it to her husband. One night they noticed that Jules had underlined certain sentences with dark, shaky pencil lines, like the lips were crimson with fresh blood, and the stream had trickled over her chin and stained the purity of her lawn death robe. Or, when the blood began to spurt out, he took my hands in one of his, holding them tight, and with the other seized my neck and pressed my mouth to the wound. When his mother saw this, she threw the book down the garbage chute. In the next morning, when Jules found the book missing, he screamed and twisted his mother's arm until she told him where the book was. He ran down to the cellar and dug in the piles of garbage until he found the book. Coffee grounds and egg yolk on his hands and wrists, he went to the park and read it again. For a month he read the book avidly. Then he knew it so well he threw it away and just thought about it. Absence notes were coming from school. His mother yelled. Jules decided to go back for a while. He wanted to write a composition. One day he wrote it in class. When everyone was finished writing, the teacher asked if anyone wanted to read their composition to the class. Jules raised his hand. The teacher was surprised, but she felt charity. She wanted to encourage him. She drew in her tiny jab of a chin and smiled. "All right," she said. "Pay attention, children. Jules is going to read us his composition." Jules stood up. He was excited. The paper shook in his hands. "My ambition by—" "Come to the front of the class, Jules, dear." Jules went to the front of the class. The teacher smiled lovingly. Jules started again. "My ambition by Jules Dracula." The smile sagged. "When I grow up, I want to be a vampire." The teacher's smiling lips jerked down and out. Her eyes popped wide. "I want to live forever and get even with everybody and make all the girls vampires. I want to smell of death." "Jules!" "I want to have a foul breath that stinks of death, earth, and crypts and sweet coffins." The teacher shuddered. Her hands twitched on her green blotter. She couldn't believe her ears. She looked at the children. They were gaping. Some of them were giggling, but not the girls. "I want to be all cold and have rotten flesh with stolen blood in the veins." "That will—" The teacher cleared her throat mightily. "That will be all, Jules," she said. Jules talked louder and desperately. "I want to sink my terrible white teeth in my victims' necks. I want them to—" Jules, go to your seat this instant. I want them to slide like razors in the flesh and into the veins. Jules read ferociously. The teacher jolted to her feet. Children were shivering. None of them were giggling. Then I want to draw my teeth out and let the blood flow easy in my mouth and run hot in my throat and... The teacher grabbed his arm. Jules tore away and ran to a corner. Barricaded behind a stool, he yelled, "And drip off my tongue and run out my lips down my victim's throat. I want to drink girl's blood." The teacher lunged for him. She dragged him out of the corner. He clawed at her and screamed all the way to the door in the principal's office. "That is my ambition! That is my ambition! That is my ambition!" It was grim. Jules was locked in his room. The teacher and the principal sat with Jules' parents. They were talking in sepulchral voices. They were recounting the scene. All along the block, parents were discussing it. Most of them didn't believe it at first. They thought their children made it up. Then they thought what horrible children they'd raised if the children could make up such things. So they believed it. After that, everyone watched Jules like a hawk. People avoided his touch and look. Parents pulled their children off the street when he approached. Everyone whispered tales of him. There were more absence notes. Jules told his mother he wasn't going to school anymore. Nothing would change his mind. He never went again. When a truant officer came to the apartment, Jules would run over the roofs until he was far away from there. A year wasted by. Jules wandered the streets, searching for something. He didn't know what. He looked in alleys. He looked in garbage cans. He looked in lots. He looked on the east side and the west side and in the middle. He couldn't find what he wanted. He rarely slept. He never spoke. He stared down all the time. He forgot his special words. Then, one day in the park, Jules strolled through the zoo. An electric shock passed through him when he saw the vampire bat. His eyes grew wide and his discolored teeth shone dully in a wide smile. From that day on, Jules went daily to the zoo and looked at the bat. He spoke to it and called it the Count. He felt in his heart it was really a man who had changed. A rebirth of culture struck him. He stole another book from the library. It told all about wildlife. He found the page on the vampire bat. He tore it out and threw the book away. He learned the selection by heart. He knew how the bat made its wound, how it lapped up the blood like a kitten drinking cream, how it walked on folded wing stalks and hind legs like a black, furry spider. Why it took no nourishment but blood. Month after month, Jules stared at the bat and talked to it. It became the one comfort in his life, the one symbol of dreams come true. One day, Jules noticed that the bottom of the wire covering the cage had come loose. He looked around, his black eyes shifting. He didn't see anyone looking. It was a cloudy day. Not many people were there. Jules tugged at the wire. It moved a little. Then he saw a man come out of the monkey house, so he pulled back his hand and strolled away whistling a song he had just made up. Late at night, when he was supposed to be asleep, he would walk barefoot past his parents' room. He would hear his father and mother snoring. He would hurry out, put on his shoes, and run to the zoo. Every time the watchman was not around, Jules would tug at the wiring. He kept on pulling it loose. When he was finished and had to run home, he pushed the wire in again. Then no one could tell. All day Jules would stand in front of the cage and look at the Count and chuckle and tell him he'd soon be free again. He told the Count all the things he knew. He told the Count he was going to practice climbing down walls head first. He told the Count not to worry. He'd soon be out. Then, together, they could go all around and drink girls' blood. One night, Jules pulled the wire out and crawled in under it into the cage. It was very dark. He crept on his knees to the little wooden house. He listened to see if he could hear the Count squeaking. He stuck his arm into the black doorway. He kept whispering. He jumped when he felt a needle jab in his finger. With a look of great pleasure in his thin face, Jules drew the fluttering hairy bat to him. He climbed down from the cage with it and ran out of the zoo, out of the park. He ran down the silent streets. It was getting late in the morning. Light touched the dark skies with gray. He couldn't go home. He had to have a place. He went down an alley and climbed over a fence. He held tight to the bat. It lapped at the dribble of blood from his fingers. He went across a yard and into a little deserted shack. It was dark inside and damp. It was full of rubble and tin cans and soggy cardboard and excrement. Jules made sure there was no way the bat could escape. Then he pulled the door tight and put a stick through the metal loop. He felt his heart beating hard and his limbs trembling. He let go of the bat. It flew to a dark corner and hung on the wood. Jules feverishly tore off his shirt. His lips shook. He smiled with a crazy smile. He reached down into his pants pocket and took out a little penknife he had stolen from his mother. He opened it and ran a finger over the blade, through the flesh. With shaking fingers he jabbed at his throat. He hacked. The blood ran through his fingers. "Count! Count!" he cried in frenzied joy. "Drink my red blood! Drink me! Drink me!" He stumbled over the tin cans and slipped and felt for the bat. It sprang from the wood and soared across the shack and fastened itself on the other side. Tears ran down Jules' cheeks. He gritted his teeth. The blood ran across his shoulders and across his thin, hairless chest. His body shook in fever. He staggered back toward the other side. He tripped and felt his side torn open on the sharp edge of a tin can. His hands went out. They clutched the bat. He placed it against his throat. He sank on his back on the cool, wet earth. He sighed. He started to moan and clutch at his chest. His stomach heaved. The black bat on his neck silently lapped his blood. He felt his life seeping away. He thought of all the years past, the waiting, his parents, school, Dracula, dreams for this sudden glory. Jules' eyes flickered open. Inside of the reeking shack swam about him. It was hard to breathe. His opened mouth to gasp the air. He opened his mouth to gasp the air. He sucked it in. It was foul. It made him cough. His skinny body lurched on the cold ground. Mists crept away in his brain, one by one, like drawn veils. Suddenly, his mind was filled with terrible clarity. He felt the aching pain in his side. He knew he was lying half naked on garbage and letting a flying bat drink his blood. With a strangled cry, he reached up and tore away the furry, throbbing bat. He flung it away from him. It came back, fanning his face with its vibrating wings. Jules staggered to his feet. He felt the door. He could barely see. He tried to stop his throat from bleeding. He managed to get the door open. Then, lurching into the dark yard, he fell on his face in the long grass blades. He tried to call out for help, but no sound save a bubbling mockery of words came from his lips. He heard the fluttering wings. Then, suddenly, they were gone. Strong fingers lifted him gently. Through dying eyes, Jules saw the tall, dark man whose eyes shone like rubies. "My son," the man said. That's a good one. Can always count on Richard Matheson. All right, brother. Thank you, sir. I appreciate you. Thanks for stopping in, man. Cue the Twilight Zone music. Yeah. Yeah, he was one of the he probably wrote a significant amount he wrote a significant amount of Twilight Zone episodes, especially in the first season. Very talented man. Quite scary. Oh, let's see. What do we got now? Okay. Our final story tonight comes from one of the most prolific authors of the last 60 years, a writer whose stories have haunted bookshelves, movie screens, and televisions for generations. First published in 1983, this is Uncle Otto's Truck by Stephen King. It's time for the king. It's a great relief to write this down. I haven't slept well since I found my Uncle Otto dead, and there have been times when I have really wondered if I have gone insane, or if I will. In a way, it would all have been more merciful if I did not have the actual object here in my study, where I can look at it, or pick it up, and heft it if I should want to. I don't want to do that. I don't want to touch that thing, but sometimes I do. If I hadn't taken it away from his little one-room house when I fled from it, I could begin persuading myself it was all only a hallucination, a figment of an overworked and overstimulated brain. But it is there. It has weight. It can be hefted in the hand. It all happened, you see. Most of you reading this memoir will not believe that, not unless something like it has happened to you. I find that the matter of your belief and my relief are mutually exclusive, however, and so I will gladly tell the tale anyway. Believe it if you want. Any tale of Gru should have a provenance or a secret. Mine has both. Let me begin with the provenance, by telling you how my Uncle Otto, who was rich by the standards of Castle County, happened to spend the last 20 years of his life in a one-room house with no plumbing on a back road in a small town. Otto was born in 1905, the eldest of the 5 Schenk children. My father, born in 1920, was the youngest. I was the youngest of my father's children, born in 1955, and so Uncle Otto always seemed very old to me. Like many industrious Germans, my grandfather and grandmother came to America with some money. My grandfather settled in Derry because of the lumber industry, which he knew something about. He did well, and his children were born into comfortable circumstances. My grandfather died in 1925. Uncle Otto, then 20, was the only child to receive a full inheritance. He moved to Castle Rock and began to speculate in real estate. In the next 5 years he had made a lot of money dealing in wood and in land. He bought a large house on Castle Hill, had servants, and enjoyed his status as a young, relatively handsome, the qualifier relatively because he wore spectacles, extremely eligible bachelor. No one thought him odd. That came later. He was hurt in the crash of '29, not as badly as some, but hurt is hurt. He held on to his big Castle Hill house until 1933, then sold it because a great tract of woodland had come on the market at a distress sale price, and he wanted it desperately. The land belonged to the New England Paper Company. New England Paper still exists today, and if you wanted to purchase shares in it, I would tell you to go right ahead. But in 1933, the company was offering huge chunks of land at fire sale prices in a last-ditch effort to stay afloat. How much land in the tract my uncle was after? That original fabulous deed has been lost, and accounts differ. But by all accounts it was better than 4,000 acres. Most of it was in Castle Rock, but it sprawled into Waterford and Harlow as well. When the deal was broken down, New England Paper was offering it for about $2.50 an acre, if the purchaser would take it all. That was a total price of about $10,000. Uncle Otto couldn't swing it, so he took a partner, a Yankee named George McCutcheon. You probably know the names Schenk and McCutcheon if you live in New England. The company was bought out long ago, but there are still Schenk and McCutcheon hardware stores in 40 New England cities, and Schenk and McCutcheon lumber yards from Central Falls to Derry. McCutcheon was a burly man with a great black beard. Like my Uncle Otto, he wore spectacles. Also, like Uncle Otto, he had inherited a sum of money. It must have been a fairish sum, because he and Uncle Otto together swung the purchase of that tract with no further trouble. Both of them were pirates under the skin, and they got on well enough together. Their partnership lasted for 22 years, until the year I was born. In fact, and prosperity was all they knew. But it all began with the purchase of those 4,000 acres, and they explored them in McCutcheon's truck, cruising the woods roads and the pulpers' tracks, grinding along in first gear for the most part, shuddering over washboards and splashing through washouts. McCutcheon at the wheel part of the time, my Uncle Otto at the wheel the rest of the time. 2 young men who had become New England land barons in the dark depths of the Big Depression. I don't know where McCutcheon came by that truck. It was a Cresswell, if it matters a breed which no longer exists. It had a huge cab, painted bright red, wide running boards, and an electric starter. But if the starter ever failed, it could be cranked, although the crank could just as easily kick back and break your shoulder. if the man cranking wasn't careful. The bed was 20 feet long, with stake sides. But what I remember best about that truck was its snout. Like the cab, it was red as blood. To get at the engine, you had to lift out 2 steel panels, one on either side. The radiator was as high as a grown man's chest. It was an ugly, monstrous thing. McCutcheon's truck broke down and was repaired, broke down again and was repaired again. Then the Cresswell finally gave up. It gave up in spectacular fashion. It went like the wonderful one-hoss shay in the Holmes poem. McCutcheon and Uncle Otto were coming up the Black Henry Road one day in 1953, and by Uncle Otto's own admission, both of them were shithouse drunk. Uncle Otto downshifted to first in order to get up Trinity Hill. That went fine. But drunk as he was, he never thought to shift up again, coming down the far side. The Cresswell's tired old engine overheated. Neither Uncle Otto nor McCutcheon saw the needle go over the red mark by the letter H on the right side of the dial. At the bottom of the hill there was an explosion that blew the engine's compartment-folding sides out like red dragon's wings. The radiator cap rocketed into the summer sky. Steam plumed up like Old Faithful. Oil went in a gusher, drenching the windshield. Uncle Otto clamped down the brake pedal, but the Cresswell had developed a bad habit of shooting brake fluid over the last year or so, and the pedal just sank to the mat. He couldn't see where he was driving, and he ran off the road, first into a ditch and then out of it. If the Cresswell had stalled, all still might have been well, but the engine continued to run, and it blew first 1 piston, then 2 more, like firecrackers on the 4th of July. One of them, Uncle Otto said, zinged right through his door, which had flopped open. The hole was big enough to put a fist through. They came to rest in a field full of August goldenrod. They would have had a fine view of the White Mountains if the windshield hadn't been covered with diamond gem oil. That was the last roundup for McCutcheon's Cresswell. It never moved from that field again. Not that there was any squawk from the landlord. The 2 of them owned it, of course. Considerably sobered by the experience, the 2 men got out to examine the damage. Neither was a mechanic, but you didn't have to be to see that the wound was mortal. Uncle Otto was stricken, or so he told my father, and offered to pay for the truck. George McCutcheon told him not to be a fool. McCutcheon was, in fact, in a kind of ecstasy. He had taken one look at the field, at the view of the mountains, and decided this was the place where he would build his retirement home. He told Uncle Otto just that, in tones one usually saves for a religious conversion. They walked back to the road together and hooked a ride into Castle Rock with the Cushman battery truck, which happened to be passing. McCutcheon told my father that it had been God's hand at work. He had been looking for just the perfect place, and there it had been all the time. In that field they passed 3 and 4 times a week, with never a spared glance. The hand of God, he reiterated, never knowing that he would die in that field 2 years later, crushed under the front end of his own truck. The truck which became Uncle Otto's truck when he died. McCutcheon had Billy Dodd hook up his wrecker to the Cresswell and drag it around so it faced the road, so he could look at it, he said, every time he went by, and know that when Dodd hooked it up again and dragged it away for good, it would be so that the construction men could come and dig him a cellar hole. He was something of a sentimentalist, but he was not a man to let sentiment stand in the way of making $1. When a pulper named Baker came by a year later and offered to buy the Cresswell's wheels, tires and all, because they were the right size to fit his rig, McCutcheon took the man's $20 like a flash. This was a man, remember, who was then worth $1 million. He also told Baker to block the truck up right smart. He said he didn't want to go past it and see it sitting in the field hip-deep in hay and timothy and goldenrod like some old derelict. Baker did it. A year later, the Cresswell rolled off the blocks and crushed McCutcheon to death. The old-timers told the story with relish, always ending by saying that they hoped old Georgie McCutcheon had enjoyed the $20 he got for those wheels. I grew up in Castle Rock. By the time I was born, my father had worked for Schenck and McCutcheon for almost 10 years. And the truck, which had become Uncle Otto's along with everything else McCutcheon owned, was a landmark in my life. My mother shopped at Warren's in Bridgeton, and the Black Henry Road was the way you got there. So every time we went, there was the truck, standing in that field with the white mountains behind it. It was no longer blocked up. Uncle Otto said that one accident was enough, but just the thought of what had happened was enough to give a small boy in knee pants a shiver. It was there in the summer, in the fall, with oak and elm trees blazing on the three edges of the field like torches. In the winter, with drifts sometimes all the way up and over its bug-eyed headlights, so that it looked like a mastodon struggling in white quicksand. In the spring, when the field was a quagmire of March mud, and you wondered that it didn't just sink into the earth. If not for the underlying backbone of good Maine rock, it might well have done just that. Through all the seasons and years, it was there. It was even in it. I was even in it once. My father pulled over to the side of the road one day when we were on our way to the Freiburg Fair, took me by the hand and led me out into the field. That would have been 1960 or 61, I suppose. I was frightened of the truck. I had heard the stories of how it had slithered forward and crushed my uncle's partner. I had heard these tales in the barber shop, sitting quiet as a mouse behind a Life magazine I couldn't read, listening to the men talk about how he had been crushed, about how they hoped old Georgie had enjoyed his $20 for those wheels. One of them might have been Billy Dodd. Crazy Frank's father said McCutcheon had looked like a pumpkin that got squat by a tractor wheel. That haunted my thoughts for months. But my father, of course, had no idea of that. My father just thought I might like to sit in the cab of that old truck. He had seen the way I looked at it every time we passed, mistaking my dread for admiration, I suppose. I remember the goldenrod, its bright yellow dulled by the October chill. I remember the gray taste of the air, a little bitter, a little sharp, and the silvery look of the dead grass. I remember that whoosh, whoosh of our footfalls. But what I remember best is the truck looming up, getting bigger and bigger, the toothy snarl of its radiator, the bloody red of its paint, the bleary gaze of the windshield. I remember fear sweeping over me in a wave colder and grayer than the taste of the air as my father put his hands in my armpits and lifted me into the cab, saying, "Drive her to Portland, Quentin. Go get her." I remember the air sweeping past my face as I went up, and then its clean taste was replaced by the smells of ancient diamond gem oil, cracked leather, mouse droppings, and I swear it, blood. I remember trying not to cry as my father stood grinning up at me, convinced he was giving me one hell of a thrill. And so he was, but not the way he thought. It came to me with perfect certainty that he would walk away then, or at least turn his back, and that the old truck would just eat me alive. And what it spat out would look chewed and broken and sort of exploded, like a pumpkin that got squat by a tractor wheel. I began to cry, and my father, who was the best of men, took me down and soothed me and carried me back to the car. He carried me up in his arms over his shoulder, and I looked at the receding truck, standing there in the field, its huge radiator looming, the dark round hole where the crank was supposed to go, looking like a horridly misplaced eye socket. And I wanted to tell him I had smelled blood, and that's why I had cried. I couldn't think of a way to do it. I suppose he wouldn't have believed me anyway. As a 5-year-old who still believed in Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy and the Alamagosalam, I also believed that the bad, scary feelings which swamped me when my father boosted me into the cab of the truck came from the truck. It took 22 years for me to decide it wasn't the Cresswell that had murdered George McCutcheon. My Uncle Otto had done that. The Cresswell was a landmark in my life, but it belonged to the whole area's consciousness as well. If you were giving someone directions on how to get from Bridgeton to Castle Rock, you told them they'd know they were going right if they saw a big old red truck sitting off to the left in a hayfield 3 miles or so after the turn from 11. You often saw tourists parked on the soft shoulder, and sometimes they got stuck there, which was always good for a laugh, taking pictures of the White Mountains with Uncle Otto's truck in the foreground for a picturesque perspective. For a long time my father called the Cresswell the Trinity Hill Memorial Tourist Truck. But after a while he stopped. By then Uncle Otto's obsession with it had gotten too strong for it to be funny. So much for provenance. Now for the secret. That he killed McCutcheon is the one thing of which I'm absolutely sure. Squat him like a pumpkin, the barbershop sages said. One of them added, I bet he was down in front of that truck praying like one of them greaseball Arabs playing to Allah. I can just picture him that way. They was tetched, to both of them. Just took it the way Otto Schenk ended up. If you don't believe me, right across the road in that little house he thought the town was going to take for a school, and just as crazy as a shithouse rat. This was greeted with nods and wise looks, because then they thought Uncle Otto was odd. All right, yeah. But there wasn't a one of the barbershop sages who considered that image, McCutcheon down on his knees in front of the truck like one of them old greaseball Arabs praying to Allah, suspicious as well as eccentric. Gossip is always a hot item in a small town. People are condemned as thieves, adulterers, poachers, and cheats on the flimsiest evidence and the wildest deductions. Often, I think the talk gets started out of no more than boredom. I think what keeps this from being actually nasty, which is how most novelists have depicted small towns from Nathaniel Hawthorne to Grace Metalius, whatever, is that most party line, grocery store, and barbershop gossip is oddly naive. It is as if these people expect meanness and shallowness will even invent it if it is not there, but that real and conscious evil may be beyond their conception, even when it floats right before their faces like a magic carpet. How do I know he did it, you ask? Simply because he was with McCutcheon that day? No, because of the truck, the Cresswell. When his obsession began to overtake him, he went to live across from it in that tiny house, even though in the last few years of his life he was deathly afraid of the truck beached across the road. I think Uncle Otto got McCutcheon out into the field where the Cresswell was blocked up by getting McCutcheon to talk about his house plans. McCutcheon was always eager to talk about his house and his approaching retirement. The partners had been made a good offer by a much larger company. I won't mention the name, but if I did, you would know it, and McCutcheon wanted to take it. Uncle Otto didn't. There had been a quiet struggle going on between them over the offer since the spring. I think that disagreement was the reason Uncle Otto decided to get rid of his partner. I think that my uncle might have prepared for the moment by doing two things. First, undermining the blocks holding the truck up, and second, planting something on the ground or perhaps in it directly in front of the truck where McCutcheon would see it. What sort of thing? I don't know. Something bright? A diamond? Nothing more than a chunk of broken glass? It doesn't matter. It winks and flashes in the sun. Maybe McCutcheon sees it. If not, you can be sure Uncle Otto points it out. "What's that?" he asks, pointing. "Dunno," McCutcheon says, and hurries over to take a look-see. McCutcheon falls on his knees in front of Cresswell, trying to work the object out of the ground, while my uncle strolls casually around to the back of the truck. One good shove and it came down, crushing McCutcheon flat, squatting him like a pumpkin. I suspect there may have been too much pirate in him to have died easily. In my imagination, I see him lying pinned beneath the Cresswell's tilted snout, blood streaming from his nose and mouth and ears, his face paper white, his eyes dark, pleading with my uncle to get help fast, pleading, then begging, and finally cursing my uncle, promising him he would get him, kill him, finish him. And my uncle standing there, watching, hands in his pockets, until it was over. It wasn't long after McCutcheon's death that my uncle began to do things that were first described by the barbershop sages as odd, then as queer, then as damn peculiar. The things which finally caused him to be deemed in the pungent barbershop argot as crazy as a shithouse rat came in the fullness of time. But there seemed little doubt in anyone's mind that his peculiarities began right around the time George McCutcheon died. In 1965, Uncle Otto had a small one-room house built across from the truck. There was a lot of talk about what old Otto Schenk might be up to out there on the Black Henry by Trinity Hill. But the surprise was total when Uncle Otto finished the little building off by having Chucky Barger slap on a coat of bright red paint, and then announcing it was a gift to the town, a fine new schoolhouse, he said, and all he asked was that they name it after his late partner. Castle Rock's selectmen were flabbergasted. So was everyone else. Most anyone in the Rock had gone to such a one-room school, or thought they had, which comes down to almost the same thing. But all of the one-room schools were gone from Castle Rock by 1965. The very last of them, the Castle Ridge School, had closed the year before. It's now Steve's Pizzaville out on Route 117. By then, the town had a glass and cinder block grammar school on the far side of the common, and a fine new high school on Carbine Street. As a result of his eccentric offer, Uncle Otto made it all the way from odd to damn peculiar in one jump. The selectmen sent him a letter. Not one of them quite dared to go see him in person, thanking him kindly and hoping he would remember the town in the future, but declining the little schoolhouse on the grounds that the educational needs of the town's children were already well provided for. Uncle Otto flew into a towering rage. Remember the town in the future? He stormed to my father. He would remember them, all right, but not the way they wanted. He had fallen off a hay truck yesterday. He hadn't fallen off a hay truck yesterday. He knew a hawk from a handsaw, and if they wanted to get into a pissing contest with him, he said, they were going to find he could piss like a polecat that had just drunk a keg of beer. So what now? My father asked him. They were sitting at the kitchen table in our house. My mother had taken her sewing upstairs. She said she didn't like Uncle Otto. She said he smelled like a man who took a bath once a month, whether he needed one or not. And him, a rich man, she would always add with a sniff. I think his smell really did offend her, but I also think she was frightened of him. By 1965, Uncle Otto had begun to look damn peculiar as well as act that way. He went around dressed in green workman's pants held up by suspenders, a thermal underwear shirt, and big yellow work shoes. His eyes had begun to roll in strange directions as he spoke. Huh? What are you going to do with the place now? Live in the son of a bitch, Uncle Otto snapped, and that's what he did. The story of his later years didn't need much telling. He suffered the dreary sort of madness that one often sees written up in cheap tabloid newspapers. Millionaire dies of malnutrition and tenement apartment. Bag lady was rich, bank records reveal. Forgotten bank tycoon dies in seclusion. He moved into the little red house. In later years, it faded to a dull, washed-out pink the very next week. Nothing my father said could talk him out of it. A year afterward, he sold the business I believe he had murdered to keep. His eccentricities had multiplied, but his business sense had not deserted him, and he realized a handsome profit. Staggering might actually be a better word. So there was my Uncle Otto, worth perhaps as much as $7 million, living in that tiny house on the Black Henry Road. His townhouse was locked up and shuttered. He had by then progressed beyond damn peculiar to crazy as a shithouse rat. The next progression was expressed in a flatter, less colorful, but more ominous phrase. Dangerous, maybe. That one is often followed by committal. In his own way, Uncle Otto became as much a fixture as the truck across the road, although I doubt if any tourists ever wanted to take his picture. He had grown a beard, which came more yellow than white, as if infected by the nicotine of his cigarettes. He had gotten very fat. His jowls sagged down and wrinkly dewlaps creased with dirt. Folks often saw him standing in the doorway of his peculiar little house, just standing there motionlessly, looking out of the road and across it, looking at the truck. His truck. When Uncle Otto stopped coming to town, it was my father who made sure that he didn't starve to death. He brought him groceries every week and paid for them out of his own pocket because Uncle Otto never paid him back. Never thought of it, I suppose. Dad died 2 years before Uncle Otto, whose money ended up going to the University of Maine Forestry Department. I understand they were delighted. Considering the amount, they should have been. After I got my driver's license in 1972, I often took the weekly groceries out. At first, Uncle Otto regarded me with narrow suspicion, but after a while he began to thaw. It was 3 years later, in 1975, when he told me for the first time that the truck was creeping toward the house. I was attending the University of Maine myself by then, but I was home for the summer and had fallen into my old habit of taking Uncle Otto his weekly groceries. He sat at his table, smoking, watching me put the canned goods away and listening to me chatter. I thought he might have forgotten who I was. Sometimes he did that, or pretended to, and once he had turned my blood cold by calling me, "That you, George?" out the window as I walked up to the house. On that particular day of July of 1975, he broke into whatever trivial conversation I was making to ask with harsh abruptness, "What do you make of yonder truck, Quentin?" That abruptness startled an honest answer out of me. "I wet my pants in the cab of that truck when I was 5, I said. "I think if I got up in it now, I'd wet them again." Uncle Otto laughed long and loud. I turned and gazed at him with wonder. I could not remember ever hearing him laugh before. It ended in a long coughing fit that turned his cheeks a bright red. Then he looked at me, his eyes glittering. "Getting closer, Quint," he said. "What, Uncle Otto?" I said. I thought he made one of his puzzling leaps from one subject to another. Maybe he meant Christmas was getting closer, or the millennium, or the return of Christ the King. "That buggerly truck," he said, looking at me in a still narrow, confidential way that I didn't like much. "Getting closer every year." "It is?" I asked cautiously, thinking that there was a new and particularly unpleasant idea. I glanced out at the Cresswell, standing across the road with hay all around it, and the white mountains behind it, and for one crazy minute it actually did seem closer. Then I blinked, and the illusion went away. The truck was right where it had always been, of course. "Oh, yeah," he said. "Gets a little closer every year." "Gee, maybe you need glasses. I can't see any difference at all, Uncle Otto." "Course you can't," he snapped. "Can't see the hour hand moved on your wristwatch either, can you? Buggerly thing moves too slow to see unless you watch it all the time, just the way I watch that truck." He winked at me, and I shivered. "Why would it move?" I asked. "It wants me, that's why," he said. "Got me in mind all the while, that truck does. One day it'll bust right in here, and that'll be the end. It'll run me down just like it did Mac, and that'll be the end." This scared me quite badly. His reasonable tone was what scared me the most, I think, and the way the young commonly respond to fright is to crack wise or become flippant. "Ought to move back to your house in town if that bothers you, Uncle Otto," I said, and you never would have known from my tone that my back was rigid with goose flesh. He looked at me, and then at the truck, and said, "Can't quit," he said. "Sometimes a man just has to stay in one place and wait for it to come to him." "Wait for what, Uncle Otto?" I asked, although I thought he must mean the truck. "Fate," he said, and winked again, but he looked frightened. My father fell ill in 1975 with kidney disease, which seemed to be improving just days before it finally killed him. Over a number of hospital visits in the fall of that year, my father and I talked about Uncle Otto. My dad had some suspicions about what might really have happened in 1955, mild ones that became the foundation of my more serious ones. My father had no idea how serious or how deep Uncle Otto's obsession with the truck had become. I did. He stood in his doorway almost all day long, looking at it like a man watching his watch to see the hour hand move. By 1981, Uncle Otto had lost his few remaining marbles. A poorer man would have been put away years before, but millions in the bank can forgive a lot of craziness in a small town, particularly if enough people think there might be something in the crazy fellow's will from the municipality. Even so, by 1981, people had begun talking seriously about having Uncle Otto put away for his own good. That flat, deadly phrase, dangerous maybe, had begun to supersede crazy as a house rat. He had taken to wandering out to urinate by the side of the road instead of walking back into the woods where his privy was. Sometimes he shook his fist at the Cresswell while he relieved himself, and more than one person passing in his or her car thought Uncle Otto was shaking his fist at them. The truck with the scenic white mountains in the background was one thing. Uncle Otto pissing by the side of the road with his suspenders hanging down by his knees was something else entirely. That was no tourist attraction. I was by then wearing a business suit more often than the blue jeans that had seen me through college when I took Uncle Otto his weekly groceries, but I still took them. I also tried to persuade him that he had to stop doing his duty by the side of the road, at least in the summertime when anyone from Michigan, Missouri, or Florida who just happened to be happening by could see him. I never got through to him. He couldn't be concerned with such minor things when he had the truck to worry about. His concern with the Cresswell had become a mania. Now he claimed it was on his side of the road, right in his yard, as a matter of fact. I woke up last night, around 3, and there it was, right outside the window, Quentin, he said. I seen it there. Moonlight shining off the windshield not 6 feet from where I was laying. And my heart almost stopped. It almost stopped, Quentin. I took him outside and pointed out that the Cresswell was right where it had always been, across the road in the field where McCutcheon had planned to build. It did no good. That's just what you see, boy, he said with a wild and infinite contempt, a cigarette shaking in one hand, his eyeballs rolling. That's just what you see. Uncle Otto, I said, attempting a witticism, what you see is what you get. It was as if he hadn't heard. Bugger almost got me, he whispered. I felt a chill. He didn't look crazy. Miserable, yes, and terrified, certainly, but not crazy. For a moment I remembered my father boosting me into the cab of that truck. I remember smelling oil and leather and blood. It almost got me, he repeated. And 3 weeks later, it did. I was the one who found him. It was Wednesday night, and I had gone out with 2 bags of groceries in the back seat, as I did almost every Wednesday night. It was hot. It was a hot, muggy evening. Every now and then thunder rumbled distantly. I remember feeling nervous as I rolled up the Black Henry Road in my Pontiac, somehow sure something was going to happen, but trying to convince myself it was just low barometric pressure. I came around the last corner, and just as my uncle's little house came into view, I had the oddest hallucination. For a moment, I thought that damned truck was really in his dooryard, big and hulking with its red paint and its rotten stake sides. I went for the brake pedal, but before my foot ever came down on it, I blinked and the illusion was gone. But I knew that Uncle Otto was dead. No trumpets, no flashing lights, just that simple knowledge, like knowing where the furniture is in a familiar room. I pulled into his dooryard in a great hurry. Oh, excuse me. Sorry about that. I pulled into his dooryard in a hurry and got out, heading for the house without bothering to get the groceries. The door was open. He never locked it. I asked him about that once, and he explained to me patiently the way you would explain a patently obvious fact to a simpleton, that locking the door would not keep the Cresswell out. He was lying on his bed, which was to the left of the one room, his kitchen area being to the right. He lay there in his green pants and his thermal underwear shirt, his eyes open and glassy. I don't believe he had been dead more than 2 hours. There were no flies and no smell, although it had been a brutally hot day. "Uncle Otto?" I spoke quietly, not expecting an answer. You don't lie in your bed with your eyes open and bugging out like that just for the hell of it. If I felt anything, it was relief. It was over. "Uncle Otto?" I approached him. "Uncle?" I stopped, seeing for the first time how strangely misshapen his lower face looked, how swelled and twisted, seeing for the first time how his eyes were not just staring but actually glaring from their sockets. But they were not looking toward the doorway or at the ceiling. They were twisted toward the little window above his bed. "I woke up last night around 3, and there it was, right outside my window, Quentin. It almost got me." "Squat him like a pumpkin," I heard one of the barber shop sages saying as I sat pretending to read a Life magazine and smelling the aromas of Vitalis and wild root cream oil. "Almost got me, Quentin." There was a smell in here. Not barber shop, and not just the stink of a dirty old man. It smelled oily, like a garage. "Uncle Otto?" I whispered, and as I walked toward the bed where he lay, I seemed to feel myself shrinking, not just in size, but in years, becoming 20 again, 15, 10, 8, 6, and finally 5. I saw my trembling hand stretch out toward his swelled face. As my hand touched him, cupping his face, I looked up, and the window was filled with the glaring windshield of the Cresswell. And although it was only for a moment, I would swear on a Bible that was no hallucination. The Cresswell was there in the window, less than 6 feet from me. I had placed my fingers on one of Uncle Otto's cheeks, my thumb on the other side, wanting to investigate the strange swelling, I suppose. When I first saw the truck in the window, my hand tried to tighten into a fist, forgetting that it was cupped loosely around the corpse's lower face. In that instant, the truck disappeared from the window like smoke, or like the ghost I suppose it was. In the same instant, I heard an awful squirting noise. Hot liquid filled my hand. I looked down, feeling not just yielding flesh and wetness, but something hard and angled. I looked down, and that was when I began to scream. Oil was pouring out of Uncle Otto's mouth and nose. Oil was leaking from the corners of his eyes like tears. Diamond gem oil, the recycled stuff you can buy in a 5-gallon plastic container, the stuff McCutcheon had always run in the Cresswell. But it wasn't just oil. There was something sticking out of his mouth. I kept screaming, but for a while I was unable to move, unable to take my oily hand from his face, unable to take my my eyes from that big, greasy thing sticking out of his mouth, the thing that had so distorted the shape of his face. At last my paralysis broke, and I fled from the house, still screaming. I ran across the dooryard to my Pontiac, flung myself in, and screamed out of there. The groceries meant for Uncle Otto tumbled off the back seat and onto the floor. The eggs broke. It was something of a wonder that I didn't kill myself in the first 2 miles. I looked down at the speedometer and saw I was doing better than 70. I pulled over and took deep breaths until I had myself under some kind of control. I began to realize that I simply could not leave Uncle Otto as I had found him. It would raise too many questions. I would have to go back. And I must admit, a certain hellish curiosity had come over me. I wish now that it hadn't, or that I had withstood it. In fact, I wish now I had let them go ahead and ask their questions, but I did go back. I stood outside his door for some 5 minutes. I stood in about the same place and in much the same position where he had stood so often and so long, looking at the truck. I stood there and came to this conclusion. The truck across the road had shifted position ever so slightly. Then I went inside. The first few flies were circling and buzzing around his face. I could see oily prints on his cheek, thumb on his left, 3 fingers on his right. I looked nervously at the window where I had seen the Cresswell looming, and then I walked over to his bed. I took out my handkerchief and wiped my fingerprints away. Then I reached forward and opened Uncle Otto's mouth. What fell out was a champion spark plug, one of the old max duty kind, nearly as big as a circus strongman's fist. I took it with me. Now I wish I hadn't done that, but of course I was in shock. It would all have been more merciful if I didn't have the actual object here in my study where I can look at it or pick it up and heft it if I should want to. In the 1920s vintage spark plug that fell out of Uncle Otto's mouth. If it wasn't there, if I hadn't taken it away from his little one-room house when I fled from it the second time, I could perhaps begin the business of persuading myself that all of it, not just coming around the turn and seeing the Cresswell pressed against the side of the little house like a huge red hound, but all of it was only a hallucination. But it is there. It catches the light. It is real. It has weight. The truck is getting closer every year, he said. And it seems now that he was right. But even Uncle Otto had no idea how close the Cresswell could get. The town verdict was that Uncle Otto had killed himself by swallowing oil, and it was a 9 days' wonder in Castle Rock. Carl Durkin, the town undertaker, and not the most close-mouthed of men, said that when the docs opened him up to do the autopsy, they found more than 3 quarts of oil in him, and not just in his stomach either. It had suffused his whole system. What everyone in town wanted to know was, what had he done with the plastic jug? For none was ever found. As I said, most of you reading this memoir won't believe it. At least, not unless something like it has happened to you. But the truck is still out there in its field. And for whatever it's worth, it all happened. Stephen King never fails. Oh, boy. Yep. Absolutely. I am so glad. Well, so as some of you know, I will be starting Winnie the Pooh tomorrow. And I wanted to give you guys a little preview of the visual I created for it. Took me half the day in Photoshop. But here it is. That's not it. Well, hell. Oh, you know what? I didn't set this one. It's over on YouTube, but it's not on here. Oh, here we go. There it is. So, yes, that's not a Winnie the Pooh story you want to read. But that is the visual for tomorrow. It took me a while in Photoshop, but got it. Now, tomorrow night will be fun. And I'm going to experiment with doing the first half of the story tomorrow and then doing the second half and the conclusion of the story on Monday. So we're going to try it. We're going to try another Monday because Monday went so well this last week that I kind of want to try it again because, you know, yeah. So that is where we will leave our stories for tonight. Thank you all for spending a little time with me this evening, and thank you to everyone who joined me throughout this last week to help celebrate my birthday. I truly appreciate it. It means the world to me. So, join me tomorrow night for Sunday Night Bedtime Stories as we begin A.A. Milne's classic Winnie the Pooh, one of my very favorite children's books. And if you enjoy these stories and would like to help support what I do here, please consider subscribing or becoming a superfan. It helps keep the campfire lit. 9 p.m. Eastern Standard, yes. And I'll be posting a promo notification. So, but subscribed or not, superfan or not, I am just happy you're here. Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey. I do have to watch that. I think it's on Tubi. Tubi has a surprisingly good selection of horror films, especially independent stuff. Thank you, Hootie Hoo. I appreciate you. That movie was just wrong. Yep. So, until tomorrow, please be kind to yourself. Be kind to each other. And be kind to yourself. Because kindness matters. And so do you. Good night, everybody.